People often say words can cut deeper than knives. For me, those words came from my own stepmother, who once looked me in the eye and called me homeless. At the time, she wasn't entirely wrong. I was broke, struggling, and unsure of where my next meal would come from. But what she didn't know was that life has a way of turning tables. Years later, that same woman would step across the polished marble floors of my mansion, unaware that she was now renting from me. I grew up in a house that never really felt like home. My earliest memories were warm ones. My mother's laughter filling the kitchen, my father working late but always making time to read me bedtime stories. But that all changed too quickly. When my mother passed away, it felt like someone had pulled the color out of my world. My father was devastated, and in his grief, he rushed into something I don't think he ever truly thought through. He remarried. At first, I wanted to believe this woman, my stepmother, would bring comfort back into our lives, maybe even some happiness. But instead, her arrival was like a storm that never passed. From the very beginning, she made it clear that I wasn't her child. She had 2 kids of her own, and the way she treated them compared to me was like night and day. They got the bigger portions at dinner, the newest clothes, and the warm smiles. I got what was left over, if there was anything at all. When I brought home a good grade from school, it barely earned a nod, but if her kids so much as scribbled on paper, it was praised and stuck on the refrigerator. Slowly, I began to shrink in my own home, becoming invisible in a place where I should have felt safe. I remember one afternoon particularly well. I had asked my father if I could join a school trip. It wasn't expensive, but it meant more to me than anything. I wanted to feel like a normal kid for once, not the outsider in my own family. My stepmother overheard the conversation and laughed, a sharp, cutting laugh that still echoes in my mind. "Why would we waste money on that?" she sneered. "You should be grateful we even keep a roof over your head." My father stayed silent, and that silence hurt worse than her words. That was just the beginning of the names and remarks she hurled at me whenever she could. Lazy, useless, a burden. Each word carved into me, leaving marks I carried even when I tried to ignore them. But the cruelest moment, the one that never truly left me, happened one evening when I came home late after spending hours at the library. I loved being there. It was the only place I felt safe, surrounded by books instead of bitterness. As soon as I stepped through the door, she was waiting, her arms crossed, her expression full of contempt. "Look at you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Always wandering around, always looking lost. You'll end up homeless one day, you know that? Homeless. Just another nobody who'll never matter." Those words cut deeper than anything she had ever said before. For days, they replayed in my head, louder than my own thoughts. At that moment, standing in the house where I was supposed to belong, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. She saw me as nothing, and my father's silence seemed to agree with her. That night, I promised myself one thing. If they were going to call me homeless, if they were going to believe I was worthless, then one day I'd prove them all wrong. The night my stepmother called me homeless was the night I realized I could no longer stay in that house. It wasn't just the cruelty of her words, it was the way my father let them hang in the air, unchallenged, as if he agreed. I packed a small bag with the few belongings I could call mine and left without saying goodbye. Walking out of that front door felt both terrifying and liberating. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I wasn't wanted. At first, I bounced from couch to couch, staying with friends who offered me a spot for a night or two. Their kindness was the only thing that kept me from sleeping on the streets, but I could feel the weight of being a guest who overstayed their welcome. I tried to make myself invisible, helping wash dishes, offering to buy groceries with the little money I had, but I knew I couldn't live like that forever. My presence was always temporary, and sooner or later I'd have to move on. Money was another battle. I took whatever small jobs I could find, washing dishes at a diner, stocking shelves at a convenience store, even sweeping floors in a mechanic shop. None of them paid much, but every dollar I earned felt like a tiny victory. Still, it was never enough. Some nights I skipped meals, convincing myself I wasn't hungry just to make the food last longer. I wore the same pair of shoes until the soles were so thin I could feel the gravel underneath my feet. But the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the exhaustion, it was the loneliness. The knowledge that I had a father and a house, yet no real home. I would see other families sitting together at restaurants or laughing in the park, and I couldn't help but wonder why I wasn't allowed that same love. I asked myself countless times if I had done something wrong, if maybe I wasn't good enough to deserve a place at the table. Those thoughts weighed heavily, pushing me to the edge of despair. There was one night I'll never forget. I was sitting outside the library after it had closed, clutching a worn-out backpack that carried everything I owned. The streetlights buzzed overhead, and the night air was cold enough to sting. For the first time, I felt like maybe my stepmother had been right, that maybe I really was nothing more than a homeless, unwanted shadow. Tears burned in my eyes, and I buried my face in my arms, trying not to let the world see me break. But as the tears fell, something inside me shifted. I thought about all the cruel words, all the nights I had gone to sleep hungry, all the times I felt invisible. And instead of letting it crush me, I made a quiet vow to myself. This wouldn't be my ending. If they thought I would disappear, they were wrong. I would take every insult, every rejection, and turn it into fuel. I didn't know how yet, but one day, I would rise so high that the same people who called me worthless would have no choice but to see me. That night, sitting under the streetlight with nothing but a backpack to my name, I hit rock bottom. But in that very moment, I also found the spark that would push me forward. Hitting rock bottom could have broken me completely, but instead, it planted a seed of determination I didn't know I had. The very next morning after that long night under the streetlight, I walked into town with one thought in mind. I had to find something, anything, that could help me climb out of the hole I was in. That's when I stumbled upon a small cafe that had a "Help Wanted" sign taped to the window. It wasn't glamorous work, washing dishes, bussing tables, and later learning how to make coffee, but it was steady, and for the first time, I had a paycheck I could rely on. I showed up early, stayed late, and volunteered for extra shifts. The owner, an older man named Mr. Thompson, noticed my work ethic and gave me more responsibilities. He wasn't the type to hand out compliments easily, but the rare nod of approval from him felt like gold. The hours were grueling, though. I'd be on my feet all day, scrubbing, carrying, wiping, and often collapsing into whatever couch or spare bed a friend could lend me for the night. My hands were constantly raw from soap and hot water, but every blister and callus felt like proof that I was moving forward, even if it was just an inch at a time. Over time, I started saving. At first, it was just a few crumpled bills tucked into an envelope. But week by week, the pile grew. I skipped buying new clothes, ate the cheapest food I could find, and resisted every temptation to spend. Watching those savings add up gave me a sense of control I'd never had before. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was slowly building. But the path wasn't smooth. There were weeks when tips were low, when I worked until my legs ached only to find my paycheck eaten away by small debts. I tried to branch out once, helping a friend start a tiny delivery service. We scraped together enough to buy a used bicycle and printed flyers to hand out around town. For a while, it felt like something promising, but after a string of missed orders and one too many broken-down tires, the idea fizzled out. It was crushing, but it taught me something valuable. Failure wasn't the end, it was just another lesson. Instead of giving up, I paid closer attention to the people around me, especially the ones who seemed to be doing better. I noticed how regulars at the cafe talked about real estate, stocks, or starting their own businesses. Their conversations felt like a foreign language at first, but I listened carefully, taking mental notes. On breaks, I'd borrow books from the library about money, business, and self-improvement. I didn't understand it all, but piece by piece, the puzzle started making sense. After almost a year at the cafe, my savings finally reached a point where I could afford something I'd been dreaming of, my own tiny apartment. It wasn't much, just a cramped studio with creaky floors and peeling paint, but it was mine. I remember standing in the middle of that bare room the day I got the keys, turning in a slow circle and grinning like a fool. For the first time since leaving my father's house, I had a space where I belonged. That apartment became my sanctuary. I furnished it with thrift store finds, cooked simple meals on a second-hand stove, and filled the corners with books I borrowed from the library. It wasn't about the size or the luxury, it was about the freedom. Each time I turned the key in the lock, I felt a quiet pride. I wasn't homeless anymore. I had built this small life with my own two hands, and though it was modest, it was just the beginning. Looking back, that was the spark. It wasn't some sudden stroke of luck or an overnight miracle. It was the result of long hours, sacrifices, failures, and stubborn persistence. That little apartment, humble as it was, became the foundation for everything that came after. The small apartment marked a turning point in my life. For the first time, I wasn't just drifting. I had a base, a place to gather my thoughts, and a sense of stability that pushed me to think bigger. I kept working at the cafe, but I also started looking for ways to grow beyond it. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life scrubbing dishes or carrying trays. I wanted something that would truly change my future. That's when I discovered an opportunity in buying and selling used electronics. It started almost by accident. A coworker sold me an old phone cheap, and I fixed it up with a few tutorials from YouTube. I listed it online and sold it for more than double what I paid. That small flip lit a fire inside me. Suddenly, I saw potential everywhere. Old laptops, broken tablets, cracked screen phones. I began buying them, repairing them late into the night in my little apartment, and selling them at a profit. At first, it was clumsy. I wasted money on a couple of devices I couldn't repair, and I spent hours wrestling with problems I didn't fully understand. But failure no longer scared me the way it once had. It was just part of the process. Slowly, I got better. The profits grew. Before long, I was making more from my side hustle than I did at the cafe. I took the leap, quit my cafe job, and threw myself fully into the business. The long hours didn't stop. I worked through nights, hunched over circuit boards, squinting under dim lights. My fingers were constantly cut or burned from soldering. But I didn't mind. The work wasn't just survival anymore. It was building something. With the extra income, I expanded. I rented a small booth at a local flea market, then a tiny shop where people could bring their electronics for repair. Word spread, customers came back, and soon I wasn't working alone. I hired one part-time assistant, then another, teaching them the same skills I had taught myself. When I first got the call from my agent about a new couple looking to rent one of the properties in my portfolio, I didn't think much of it. But when he mentioned their names, I froze. My stepmother. My father. The same woman who once looked me in the eyes and told me I'd end up homeless was now inquiring about renting one of my homes. The irony was almost too much to process. At first, I considered staying behind the scenes, letting my agent handle the entire transaction. Part of me didn't even want to see them. But another part, the stronger part, knew that this was a moment I had been unconsciously waiting for my whole life. Not for revenge, exactly, but for the chance to stand face to face with the people who once made me feel like nothing and show them just how wrong they had been. The day of the showing arrived. My stepmother walked into the mansion as if she belonged there, her sharp eyes scanning the high ceilings, the polished floors, the sprawling garden outside. She had no idea. Not a flicker of recognition crossed her face as she complimented the landlord for maintaining such a fine property. I stood there quietly, dressed sharply, watching her every movement, every word. She didn't know that the walls she admired, the floors she walked on, all belonged to the same stepchild she once dismissed as a future nobody. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because she had no idea just how much the tables had turned. The showing began like any other. My agent introduced me as the property manager, a formality to explain why I'd be present during the tour. My father gave me a polite nod, clearly not recognizing me at first, but my stepmother was too busy inspecting the details of the mansion to even notice. She trailed her fingers across the polished banisters, admired the chandeliers, and commented on how some people must know how to live well. I had to suppress a smile. She walked through the marble-floored foyer, into the living room with its grand windows and soft, sunlit curtains, and her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. She was impressed, truly impressed. I stood back and let her gush about how perfect it would be for entertaining, how she could already picture herself sipping tea on the terrace. Every word she spoke felt like a strange reversal of all those years. She made me feel like I didn't belong anywhere. Finally, my agent excused himself to take a call, leaving just the three of us in the cavernous living room. My father turned to me with a faint flicker of recognition. His eyes narrowed, then widened. "Wait," he said slowly. "Is that you?" My stepmother whipped around, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion. "What is he talking about?" she asked sharply. I met her eyes, and for the first time in years, I didn't look away. "Yes," I said evenly. "It's me." Her jaw tightened, but she still looked baffled. "What are you doing here? Are you working for the landlord or something?" That was the moment, the one I had played in my head 1,000 times before. I let a small smile tug at the corner of my mouth. "I don't work for the landlord," I said, my voice steady. "I am the landlord. This mansion, this entire property, is mine." The words hung in the air like thunder. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the ticking of the ornate grandfather clock in the corner. My stepmother blinked, her confident posture faltering as the meaning sank in. She looked around again, at the gilded frames, the marble, the sweeping staircase, as though trying to reconcile the boy she once called homeless with the man standing before her. "That's impossible," she muttered, shaking her head. You could never." But her voice trailed off, the disbelief cracking into something else, fear or maybe shame. My father didn't say much. He only looked down at the floor, his silence echoing all the times he had stayed silent when I needed him most. I let the silence stretch before I finally spoke again. "Funny, isn't it? You once told me I'd end up homeless. Now here you are, asking to rent a home from me." Her face flushed red, and for once, she had no sharp remark ready. The arrogance I had grown up with was gone, replaced by something I never thought I'd see in her: humility. In that moment, I didn't feel anger or triumph. I just felt free. After that day, something in me shifted. It wasn't the mansion, the money, or even the power that mattered most. It was the realization that I had climbed out of the hole they once pushed me into. I thought back to the hungry nights, the endless shifts, the failures that felt unbearable at the time, and I realized each of those moments had shaped me into the person standing there. My stepmother treated me differently after the reveal. She wasn't warm, not suddenly affectionate or kind, but there was a quiet respect in her tone now, an acknowledgement she could no longer deny. For years, she had called me worthless, laughed at my dreams, and dismissed me as nothing. Now, her silence carried weight. It was an admission that she had been wrong. But even in that victory, I knew the scars would never completely fade. The sting of those words, "You'll end up homeless," still echoed in my mind. And yet, I no longer let them define me. Instead, I let them remind me of how far I had come. In the end, I chose to forgive her, not for her sake, but for mine. Forgiveness was freedom. Forgetting, though, that was impossible. Life has a strange way of rewriting stories. The same woman who once sneered and called me homeless now hands over rent checks with my name on them. But this isn't about revenge. It's about growth. Every insult, every cold glance, and every rejection became fuel for my rise. If you've ever been told you're nothing, remember, those words don't define you. Your actions, your persistence, and your belief in yourself do. And sometimes, the sweetest success is simply living well.